Why was everyone laughing at her? The jeers cracked through the war room like gunfire, bouncing off metal walls, cutting sharper than any blade. Uniformed men leaned back in their chairs, smirks curling, coffee cups trembling against saucers as though even porcelain mocked her. She stood alone at the end of the oval table, her rank patch still fresh on her sleeve, her voice not yet heavy with years. "You think you're ready for the spirit. Don't embarrass yourself, Captain." The words came from a colonel whose medals gleamed so bright they seemed designed to blind. Laughter followed like a wave. Some of it was cruel, some of it nervous, but none of it came to her defense. Storm Kain did not rise to the bait. She had learned long ago that silence could speak louder than rage. Instead, she let her hand drift across the glowing war map. Her fingertip traced a line so reckless that the laughter stopped cold. The room quieted, not because they believed her, but because geometry has a way of silencing arrogance. Her path cut across the western sea, threaded inland through valleys, slipped past radar cones that bloomed like poisonous flowers, and skimmed jagged ridges where one mistake meant death. It was madness. It was also math. She didn't lift her eyes, didn't seek approval. The line was enough. The silence thickened until General Mercer broke it. Iron Fang, they called him, though never to his face. His arms folded as if he could crush her idea just by holding still. His voice was raw granite. "Neat drawing, Captain, but war is not a chalkboard." Every word was meant to hammer her back into her place, but she didn't move her hand. "Sir," she said, tone steady, "this isn't neat, it's necessary. The southern corridor guarantees detection. Terrain masking buys us time. Time buys us surprise. Surprise buys us survival." A snort from the far side. "You sound like a manual." "Manuals don't do this." She shifted 2 fingers, layering wind vectors over topography. The line bent, sliding through gaps so small even the algorithms hesitated before calculating. The predicted detection window shrank to a number smaller than anyone in the room wanted to believe. Silence again, not agreement but unease. Colonel Cross, the decorated B-2 pilot with eyes that gave away nothing, finally spoke. "I recommend the established corridors. The margin for error exists for a reason." Margin for error, a phrase heavy as an anchor deployed like a weapon. His eyes never left the glowing display. "The enemy builds for our caution. We give them caution, we give them time, and time is the one thing we cannot afford." It wasn't heat that changed the room. It was vacuum. Her words pulled the oxygen out, left every officer staring at her as if she had cracked open a truth they weren't ready to see. The operations chief cleared his throat, muttered jargon, tried to refill the gap. Mercer silenced him with a palm. "We are not here to audition courage," Mercer said. "We are here to measure survival." "Exactly," replied. "And survival isn't found in what's safe, it's found in what works." She tilted the map 40 degrees. Valleys shifted, radar fields fractured into lattices, and a seam appeared in the defense net that no one had noticed before. Thin as a whisper, fragile as a promise, but real. A young intel officer at the back forgot his place. "Sir, the captain's corridor intersects a blind sector. It's tight, but—" "Return to your station, Lieutenant," Mercer snapped. But the word hung in the air, real. Cross shifted in his chair. Not defiance, not dismissal, just the weight of a man who had flown long enough to recognize when math was speaking. "Suppose you thread it," Mercer growled. "Suppose you are invisible. You still have to strike 9 targets, spread across a region, without tripping the hornet's nest." Finally lifted her hand from the map. Her voice softened. "We don't need second chances. We need the first one to count." The silence that followed was not disbelief. It was calculation. Men who had mocked her now weighing whether audacity was really just another word for vision. Mercer studied her the way a surgeon studies a blade, testing whether it would cut true. "If you fail," he said at last, We lose more than an aircraft. We lose the war's momentum. If you succeed, you will have done what every senior officer here swore could not be done. That has its own cost. She knew what he meant. Success rearranges rooms. It asks institutions to look in the mirror. It forces men like Mercer to admit they were wrong. She nodded once, understood. Mercer's jaw pulsed. He turned to Cross. Colonel, Eastern profile, safer, cleaner. But Cross hesitated, just long enough. And saw it. The hesitation was her victory. "Sir," she said quietly, "the Eastern profile assumes a temperature gradient that doesn't exist anymore. Their radar has already adapted. That route will light us up like a parade." The word cut like a fracture. Parade. A bomber lit in the sky for all the world to see. The operations chief, against his better judgment, ran the simulation. Updated numbers flooded the display. The eastern path glowed crimson, unforgiving. Mercer didn't apologize. Generals never did, but his silence was heavier than any admission. Finally he spoke, "Then draw the rest." Her hand moved again. Blue lines became a lattice of timing marks, release points set to the rhythm of terrain shadows, not doctrine. She layered decoys, signed the sky with asymmetry, drew a plan not from manuals but from instinct and memory. The room changed. Contempt hardened into concentration. Men leaned forward. Even Cross studied the lines with a professional's respect. Mercer's voice, when it came, was steel. "If we do this, we do it with the best skin, the spirit of." Brief in 30, wheels up at first light. No dramatic slam of a fist, no flourish, just a release of air like a verdict carried on gravel. Chairs scraped, papers slid into folders. The young lieutenant dared one glance at her, something between fear and gratitude. Cross paused as he passed, his voice low. "Watch the crosswinds near Ridge 17. They dance." She met his eyes, noted. And for a heartbeat they were not rivals, not doubter and doubted, just two pilots staring at the same sky. When the room emptied, she stayed, alone with the path she had drawn, alone with silence that wasn't ridicule but responsibility. Her hand hovered over the glass, feeling the faint hum of the projector. She would not carry their laughter into the mission. She would carry the line. Outside, under hard daylight, mechanics moved like ants across the apron. And far down the runway, a stealth bomber slept like a slice of night misplaced in noon, its name painted beneath the cockpit. She let the final words of the day's mockery replay in her head, not as an insult, but as fuel. "You think you're ready for the spirit. Don't embarrass yourself, Captain." She smiled faintly, not in triumph but in promise. They would remember this night. And as the door closed behind her, the corridor smelled of jet fuel and chalk dust. Her hands flexed once, calibrating not the machine but herself. Because tomorrow she would walk into the black wing of, and the sky itself would decide who had been right. Why did her grandfather's voice return now, on the eve of war? The war room had emptied hours ago, yet lingered at the edge of the glowing display. Her fingertips pressed into the cold console, as if steadying the thin blue line she had traced. Outside, the sun burned hard against the tarmac, but in her mind rose another sun, one that had hung low above the Nevada desert when she was young. Her grandfather, Victor Storm, had never been gentle. Retired from the Air Force with a chest of medals he rarely touched, he carried the weight of Cold War skis in his bones. To the world, he was a relic. To her, he was the man who turned flying into a language. He would take her out to the desert in a battered whose paint flaked like dry riverbeds. No GPS, no autopilot, just a compass, a star chart, and the raw silence of open sky. "Machines fail," he used to say, his voice gravel, his eyes locked on the horizon. "Batteries die, satellites get blinded, but stars don't lie. Learn their rhythm and you'll never be lost." Back then she thought it eccentric, old men and their stories. But in the years since, she had learned what he'd really been giving her, not tricks but trust. Trust in her own capacity to think beyond systems. Confidence to question the map when it looked wrong. Instinct sharpened by silence. That training had made her different. In the university, while classmates memorized equations, she asked why the numbers bent the way they did. In training, when simulations collapsed, blackouts, system failures, sudden electronic attacks, she thrived. When screens died, she closed her eyes and counted. When instruments lied, she listened to the air. It was no rebellion. It was inevitability. The desert had carved the decision into her long before she signed enlistment papers. But none of that mattered now. Not in this sterile corridor of fort where fluorescent lights buzzed and protocol pressed like concrete. Here, her instincts felt like contraband. She carried them anyway. A salute caught her off guard. A security officer at the door, eyes flickering with disbelief that the same captain mocked in the briefing now carried the weight of the mission. She returned the salute with measured calm. Not triumph, not defiance, just steady composure. Inside the operations wing, screens glowed with new intelligence. Convoys resupplying forward defenses, bunkers sealing, mobile launchers sliding into camouflaged alcoves. The 9 fortresses weren't just bases. They were knots in a web binding resources, shipping lanes, and communications into one net. Cut one strand, the rest held. Cut them all in sequence, the web collapsed. To most, it looked impenetrable. To her, it looked like a puzzle designed by people who assumed the enemy would always think conventionally. The same lieutenant who had dared speak in her defense sat hunched over a data feed, his jaw tight. When he saw her, he stiffened, unsure whether to apologize for his earlier outburst. "You saw it," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am," his voice cracked. "The northwest blind spot is real, most wouldn't risk it, but it's there." "The difference between most and one," she replied, "is history." The weight of her words settled over him. She saw it in his shoulders, as though she had just handed him responsibility heavier than rank. Later, alone in her quarters, she spread charts across the desk the way her grandfather once spread maps on a kitchen table. Her lamp cast thin light. She traced countermeasures the enemy might deploy after her first strike. If she failed, the net would close around her after one base. Maybe two. She needed choreography, every step precise. The clock ticked louder than she liked. She flexed her hands. They didn't tremble, they never did under weight. But she flexed anyway, reminding herself, pilots don't fly with hands, they fly with judgment. The hands only follow. A knock broke her focus. Colonel Cross entered, uninvited. His face was a mask of professionalism, but his eyes betrayed the weight of a man who had seen too many missions go wrong. "I don't like this," he admitted. "You don't have to," she said, folding her map. Cross didn't move. His voice dropped lower. "It isn't about what I like. It's about whether you're ready to fly a machine that doesn't forgive mistakes. The B-2 isn't a falcon. It's patience wrapped in steel. Treat it like a bird of prey and it will bury you." Met his stare. "Then I won't treat it like a falcon. I'll treat it like a weapon designed to end wars before they start." Cross studied her face, searching for bravado, for cracks. He found none. At last he gave a single nod. "Ridge 17, he said quietly. "The crosswinds do a dance. Don't let them push you above the terrain. Don't." When he left, she exhaled slowly. Not relief, calibration. Even descent carried truth worth carrying. Night deepened beyond the barracks windows. She traced her grandfather's old compass with her thumb. The needle sluggish, the case dented. She slipped it into her flight bag, not because she expected to use it, but because reminders matter. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass. Not a novice, not a prodigy, just a pilot with one chance to prove survival belongs to those willing to see the sky differently. At dawn, the War Council reconvened. Mercer stood rigid, silver hair like steel wire, his voice gravel poured into iron. "The enemy tightens their grip. The clock is closing. Colonel Cross will fly. Captain Kain will remain in tactical support. Prudence demands it. Slid a folder across the table. A hologram bloomed. Peaks and valleys shimmered. Radar cones spun like blades. With a flick of her hand, she revealed Cross's route. Crimson vulnerability lit up the model. Prudence is a false friend, she said. Their radars aren't static, they're learning. This corridor is a trap. Cross's voice was sharp. You're saying every calculation my team ran is worthless. I'm saying your calculations are accurate for a world that no longer exists. The words cracked like a whip. Officers who had been staring at their screens now shifted, glancing between them. Mercer raised his palm to silence her, but she pressed forward. Look here. Her hand drew her line again, narrow, threading blind spots most didn't dare. It's risk, yes, but the only path alive. You're describing a daredevil maneuver, not strategy, Mercer growled. Options vanish the moment their sensors wake up. Sir, caution will kill us faster than risk. The room tilted, half the officers drawn to her audacity, half recoiling. Cross clenched his jaw, Mercer's knuckles whitened on the table. Finally Mercer exhaled. Very well, you get your chance. But if you fail, no one will remember the argument you won here, only the disaster you caused. She inclined her head. No smile, no triumph, just acknowledgement of the weight settling squarely on her shoulders. Minutes later, the base roared to life. Hangar doors rumbled open, fuel lines uncoiled, weapons carts rolled. On the apron, the spirit of gleamed, a blade of shadow against pale sun. Walked its length, fingers brushing its edges, not doubting the crew's work, absorbing the reality. This was no longer theory. This was steel she would entrust with her life. The crew chief approached, grease under his nails. All systems checked, payload primed. She's yours, ma'am. Thank you, Sergeant. He hesitated, voice low. Ma'am, we've never seen anyone fight for this jet the way you just did. Bring her back. She nodded, a silent promise. On the observation deck, Mercer stood with his arms crossed, his eyes locked on the black triangle. To him, it wasn't just an aircraft. It was a wager. The briefing was stripped of ceremony. Coordinates, timing, fail-safes, delivered with brutal efficiency. Mercer's voice carried through the hangar. Captain Kain, understand this. If you fall short, we lose more than a bomber. If you succeed, he stopped himself. He would not offer hope aloud. She met his gaze. I understand, sir. When the crew dispersed, she was alone with the bomber. She climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The confined space hummed with restrained power. Screens blinked alive. Switches glowed faintly. She adjusted her seat, fastened harness straps, rested her helmet at her knee. The canopy sealed with a heavy thud, cutting her off from the world. Here there were no generals, no laughter, no doubt, just her, and the machine, and the endless sky waiting. Her pre-flight checks moved like ritual. Hydraulics green, fuel pressure steady, avionics calibrated. Yet beneath it all, her mind stretched forward into hostile territory, imagining every defense tightening by the minute. She pictured her grandfather nodding once, as if to remind her, precision is not about numbers. It is about trust in the line you draw. Outside, ground crews cleared. Engines spooled to life, deep but muted by stealth design. The bomber shuddered, then steadied. Spirit 1, this is Control, came the voice in her headset. You are authorized for immediate departure. Execute Operation Nightfall. Nightfall, the code name hastily assigned to her mission, a name carrying more than strategy. It carried truth. If she failed, darkness would fall on them all. She eased the throttle forward. Tires rattled against concrete seams. At rotation speed, she pulled back. The spirit of lifted, severing Earth's grip with the grace of a shadow. From the tower, Mercer watched until the aircraft vanished into the horizon. His officers whispered telemetry, but his gaze lingered. For the first time in decades, he felt uncertainty. Not about the mission, about the limits of what was possible when someone dared to redraw the sky. At altitude adjusted course, the horizon stretched infinite, mountains rose like jagged teeth, her pulse steadied, her breathing matched the engine's. She whispered once, not as comfort but confirmation. 9 fortresses, 1 chance. And as the spirit of cut into hostile air, the world shifted toward a reckoning only she could deliver. How do you hide a bomber the size of a cathedral? That was the question gnawing at the enemy radar crews below. They didn't know she was already here. The spirit of climbed smoothly, wings merging with the dawn sky until it looked more like a shadow than an aircraft. Inside, the cockpit glowed dimly, instruments whispering their endless data. Storm Kain sat steady, hands precise, her heartbeat aligned with the hum of engines. She reached across the panel, engaged the full suite of stealth systems, and in a sequence of clicks and quiet confirmations, she vanished. To the world below, she was gone. The landscape stretched beneath her like a painted map, ridges, plains, thin silver rivers catching the light. To most eyes, it looked peaceful. To hers, it was alive with threats. Every valley held radar cones. Every plateau bristled with missile batteries. She wasn't flying practice runs over Nevada anymore. She was trespassing into a grid designed to annihilate her. Mercer's warning replayed in her head. Failure isn't personal. Failure collapses the war. The thought pressed hard, but she did not let it seep into her rhythm. Instead, she reached back further into memory, into her grandfather's voice. Stars don't lie. Silence doesn't betray you. Trust the line. Her radio crackled faintly. Spirit 1, control, confirm climb complete. She pressed her mic, voice clipped. Climb complete, course it from here forward. No one would hold her hand. The line she drew was hers alone to follow. Ahead, dark cloud banks swelled. Most pilots would avoid it. She welcomed it. Radar struggled with weather clutter. If she could ride the turbulence, she could slip closer under their noses. The bomber's nose angled forward, sinking into the storm's gray belly. Rain slashed across her canopy, vanishing into steam. Lightning flickered, painting her panels in bursts of white. Bucked under sudden gusts, a beast restless in its cage, but her hands held steady. Not bravado, necessity. Minutes stretched into eternity inside the storm. Then sunlight again. She emerged into clean sky, the world stretched wide. And there, her first markers. Faint pulses sweeping the air in intervals. Mobile radars, not static towers, but arrays that shifted like hunters adjusting traps. If she had flown the route Cross wanted, she'd already be lit up. But her valley path tucked her behind a spine of mountains. Safe for now. Her display chimed. First objective ahead. A command hub disguised inside the hills, its coordination antennas rising like weeds above the rock. If she failed here, the rest would close ranks instantly. She checked her systems, payload armed, trajectory locked, guidance primed. Her throat tightened not with fear but with clarity. "This is why I'm here," she whispered. "Not to argue in rooms, to act." The valley opened like a mouth. She nudged lower, hugging the contours. Crosswinds rolled off the ridges, trying to push her off course. She corrected with tiny adjustments, her breath slowing to match. The release cue blinked. She pressed. A muffled thud reverberated through the fuselage as the first precision weapon detached. She didn't watch it fall. She was already adjusting for egress, nose banking hard into the next valley. Seconds later, her screen confirmed impact. A silent bloom underground, antennas shredded, the hub erased. "Target 1, she murmured, "gone." No triumph, just motion, focus. Her second target was minutes away. A buried communications array linking the entire fortress network. She veered deeper into jagged folds of terrain, each ridge a wall between her and discovery. Again the release chime. Again her weapon vanished beneath her. She banked instantly, slipping left into tree shadow, avoiding the angle their sensors expected. Seconds later, the comms net went dark. Static bloomed across the spectrum. 2 down, she breathed. No pride, pride distracted, pride killed. The third strike was harder, a missile battery hidden along a plateau. Camouflage concealed its launchers until they rose, ready to spit fire with no warning. Her targeting systems beeped with urgency. She ignored them. She trusted her own math, her own line. She dipped into a shallow dive through a weather front skirting the plateau. Clouds scattered radar returns, hid her altitude shift. The hatches opened, launchers rising too late. She released, pulled into a brutal climb, G-forces pressing her spine into the seat. The weapon hit. A roar. The battery ignited in its own fury, missiles destroyed before they cleared the tubes. 3 gone. Smoke mushroomed behind her, invisible to most, but loud to those who had mocked her back at fort. For the first time, enemy chatter sparked in her headset, scrambled, frantic. Radar sweeps grew sharper. The net was waking. She tightened her grip on the yoke. Wasn't nimble. It wasn't meant to dance, but under her hands it obeyed. The fourth target was a supply depot bristling with defenses. She dipped low into valleys so narrow the wingtips seemed to scrape stone. Warning tones shrieked. She silenced them. Her instinct guided her through. She released. A chain reaction, fuel igniting, secondary explosions rippling outward. The plateau flattened in fire. 4, she whispered. And that's when the missiles came. Radar lock shrieked in her headset. A battery had caught her silhouette at the canyon mouth. Trails of white fire slashed upward, spears tearing through the sky. Was no fighter. She was heavy steel, but refused inevitability. She shoved the nose down, diving to treetop level, branches a blur beneath her. Then she yanked into a climb so vicious her vision tunneled. G-force crushed her lungs. The bomber groaned like steel under siege. The missiles corrected, seeking, clawing for her. She released decoys, streams of heat signatures scattering like falling stars. The missiles split. Some chased the flares, some collided midair. Explosions lit the sky, a storm of fire. Burst through the smoke, alive. Breathing hard but steady, she adjusted course. Ahead, the fifth target, another command relay disguised as a fortress. She aligned, released, and banked. The blast rolled across the valley, shaking her bones. 5 gone. Enemy comms crackled louder, desperate, furious. Radar sweeps stabbed harder, faster, but they no longer overlapped cleanly. The grid was beginning to fray. Her display flashed warnings. Fighters scrambled, fast interceptors, silver knives cutting the air toward her. Wasn't built to fight them, but stealth was her shield. Pitched upward into a shallow climb, then cut power slightly, blending into background clutter. Seconds stretched. The interceptors roared past, their instruments fooled. She exhaled once, relief brief, fleeting. Her next target loomed, a coastal bunker with missile tubes aimed to sea. Fortress 7. She steadied her bomber, aligned and pressed. The weapon tore through concrete, igniting stored warheads. The shoreline shook, waves battering cliffs. 7 gone. The chatter in her headset was chaos now. Confusion, contradictions, commanders shouting at ghosts. She banked inland again. 2 left, the most dangerous. The 8th fortress, the network's nerve core, buried beneath reinforced hills, ringed by overlapping missile shields. She slowed. This strike had to unravel the whole net. She activated her custom algorithm. Phantom echoes scattered across enemy screens, painting false squadrons rushing in from the west. Operators panicked, redirecting fire into empty sky. She slipped beneath their chaos, hugging ridges. Release Q, weapon away. Seconds later, the hub collapsed inward, the entire network fracturing into static. 8 gone. But as she turned toward the 9th, the last fortress, her alarms shrieked. Every surviving radar, every launcher, every interceptor converged on one point, her. Her hands tightened, her grandfather's words whispered in memory. Sometimes one mission changes history. She banked into the final approach, a solitary shadow diving into a storm of fire. The battle for the last fortress had begun. What happens when the sky itself turns against you? The ninth fortress rose on her display like a wall of steel. A final knot in the enemy's net, bristling with radars, missile silos, interceptors, everything they had left. Its defenses pulsed across her screens in overlapping circles, no seam, no mercy. Every radar in the region pivoted toward her, 1,000 invisible eyes narrowing to catch one shadow. The spirit of thundered forward, engines muted by stealth, yet vibrating through her bones. Warnings screamed in her headset. The system painted the truth she already knew: missiles primed, interceptors inbound, batteries aligned. They were throwing the weight of their war into this last stand. For the first time, resisted her, not from failure but from pressure. She was asking the aircraft to do what no manual had ever dared. She eased lower, folding into jagged terrain. Ridges rose like serrated teeth, clawing at her wingtips. Her eyes darted between instruments and horizon, calculations firing in her mind faster than computers could keep up. And then the launch. White trails erupted skyward, dozens of them, missiles clawing for her silhouette. Her cockpit screamed with alarms. She silenced them with a single touch. Machines didn't need to remind her she was seconds from death. She banked sharp. The bomber groaned, metal straining. For an instant, the wings looked impossibly wide for the canyon. Cliffs blurred past. Missiles detonated against rock faces, fooled by her dive. Shards of stone rattled across the skin like a storm of hammers. Heat washed the canopy. Still, she climbed again, rolling out into open sky. More missiles cut across her path, faster now, adjusting angles with merciless precision. She toggled countermeasures. Flares burst into the air like falling stars. Missiles split, some fooled, others stubborn, still locked on her. Her pulse stayed steady. She remembered nights in the desert, her grandfather's voice. Stars never lie. She searched the canopy for constellations, faint but present. She aligned by instinct, yanking into a climb only her mental math could justify. The missiles overshot, detonating in thunderclaps that lit her cockpit orange. Lived. But the fortress below had not fired its full fury yet. Guns erupted, radars swept, interceptors screamed upward. The sky filled with fire. Her targeting display locked onto the command bunker, the heart of the fortress, the nexus holding the net together. She armed the final payload. But the system faltered. Guidance scrambled, jammed by the fortress's signal density. Coordinates jittered, uncertain, as though the machine itself doubted her. She didn't. Her fingers flew across the panel, overriding automation, inputting manual corrections. She recalculated by instinct the way wind bent across ridges, the way terrain curved beneath. Numbers and stars aligned in her mind. She didn't just see the map, she felt it. "Release," she whispered. The weapon detached, vanished beneath her into the storm below. She banked hard, fleeing. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the world tore open. A column of fire surged skyward, brighter than dawn. Shockwaves rolled through her chest, rattling her teeth. Concrete folded like paper. Steel bent and twisted into molten arcs. The final fortress was gone. The grid collapsed instantly. Radars flickered into static. Missiles fell silent. Enemy comms turned to chaos, officers shouting, commanders tripping over disbelief. 9 fortresses, all ash. Allowed herself one breath, deep and grounding. Then she reached for her radio. "Control, Spirit 1. Mission complete. All targets neutralized." Silence stretched unbearably long. Then Mercer's gravel voice cut in. "Spirit 1, confirm, all 9. Her tone was steady. "Confirmed. 9 enemy bases destroyed, network eliminated." Back at fort, the operations floor erupted. Officers gripped each other, disbelief spilling into cheers. Screens replayed her strikes on loop, the impossible made undeniable. On the observation deck, Mercer stood motionless. His hand trembled slightly against the railing. For decades he had dismissed innovation as gamble, clung to tradition as shield. But now, the horizon seared with proof that a single captain had done what his entire doctrine swore could not be done. His voice softened, gravel giving way to reverence. Spirit One, what you've done today will be studied for generations. You've turned every law we thought immutable upside down. Her reply was simple. Sir, I just drew the line no one else would. She turned toward home. Adrenaline drained, leaving clarity. She had endured everything: mockery in the war room, the fury of an entire fortress network, the limits of a machine not built for improvisation. And she had endured. Hours later, the runway of fort stretched beneath her. Mechanics, officers, soldiers who once doubted her now stood silent, lining the tarmac. Touched down, tires kissing concrete, rolled to a stop. Engines faded into silence. The canopy lifted. She climbed down, helmet tucked beneath her arm. Her uniform smelled of scorched metal, her gloves stiff with sweat, her heartbeat still sinking to the rhythm of battle. No roar of applause, just silence so heavy it bent the air. Generals lowered their eyes. Crew chiefs froze. Commanders who once sneered at her now had nothing left but the hollow weight of their doubt. She hadn't just flown the mission. She had redefined what it meant to carry a nation on her shoulders alone. For a moment no one moved. Then a ripple of clapping, small, then swelling, until the hangar roared with it. Mercer stepped forward, face torn between pride and humility. He extended his hand. Major Storm Kain, the rank she had not yet been given but had already earned. She shook it firmly. No smile, no flourish, just acknowledgement that the sky no longer belonged only to tradition. Weeks later, her tactics would be into manuals that once dismissed them as reckless. Cadets would whisper her name as legend, tracing maps with fingers as if following her very arcs. But here on the tarmac, as cooled behind her, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not for history, not for glory, for something simpler. She had proven survival belonged not to those who followed the line, but to those willing to redraw it. The laughter that once filled the war room was gone. In its place was silence and respect. And far beyond the base, in the ruins of 9 shattered fortresses, the enemy would remember the night the sky itself betrayed them. Why didn't victory feel like victory? The 9th fortress was ash. The enemy grid was broken. The war's tide had shifted in a single night. And yet, as Storm Kain walked across the cooling tarmac, her boots heavy with sweat and dust, there was no lightness in her chest. Applause echoed in the hangar, but it sounded distant, hollow, like rain on an empty roof. She nodded to the mechanics, acknowledged the officers, shook Mercer's hand. Outwardly, she moved with composure. Inwardly, silence clung to her like a shadow. Because she knew something the others didn't. Every strike, every evasion, every impossible line drawn across hostile sky, it hadn't been luck. It hadn't been clean. It had been survival balanced on the knife edge of chance. One miscalculation, one hesitation, and would have been nothing more than debris in a canyon. The 9 fortresses would still stand. The war would still be lost. And she would have vanished as just another name on a wall. That truth weighed heavier than the applause. Mercer escorted her to the debriefing room, his steps uncharacteristically slow. Inside, officers filled the space with papers, charts, endless noise. But when she entered, the noise died. Every gaze locked on her, some with admiration, some with unease. She sat at the head of the table, the same table where, only days ago, she had been laughed at. The war map glowed again, red fortresses blinking into gray ruin. An intel officer broke the silence. 9 confirmed. Enemy comms in disarray. Supply chains cut. They won't recover from this for months, maybe years. Whispers spread. Heads nodded. Relief swelled. But Mercer's eyes stayed on her. not celebratory, measuring. He knew victory was never free. "Captain Kain," he said, voice heavy, "walk us through it." She did, methodical, precise, not embellishing, not dramatizing, just facts: storm navigation through the ridges, radar blind spots, decoys deployed at exact intervals, weapons dropped with no margin for error. When she finished, silence returned. Colonel Cross leaned forward. His tone carried no resentment, only respect. "You flew the Spirit harder than it was ever meant to be flown. You knew the risks. Why did you insist?" Her eyes flicked to him, then back to the map. Because safety was an illusion. The only real danger was hesitation. The words hung heavy. No one challenged them. After the debrief, Mercer dismissed the officers. The room emptied, leaving only the two of them. For a long moment he said nothing. Just studied her as if trying to reconcile the young woman mocked days ago with the pilot who had redrawn the war. Finally he spoke. "I was wrong." She blinked. "Generals didn't say such things." "You saw what we did not," he continued. "Not because you had better tools, because you had the courage to question them. That courage carried a nation tonight." She shifted uncomfortably. "It carried me, sir, nothing more." His voice softened, gravel worn down to sand. "That humility will protect you, but don't mistake it. What you did tonight will echo far beyond these walls. History will remember." She wanted to believe him, but history wasn't what weighed on her. What weighed was the silence in the cockpit after the ninth strike, the moment she realized she had survived what no one believed survivable. That silence hadn't been triumph. It had been loneliness. In her quarters, hours later, the adrenaline finally drained. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, helmet at her side. Her gloves still smelled of scorched metal. Her eyes closed. And for the first time since she lifted off the runway, she allowed her hands to tremble. The war would celebrate her. The base would raise her name. Manuals would etch her tactics in ink, but none of them would feel what she had felt in those ridges. The bone-crushing G-forces, the hollow silence between missile locks, the moment where the sky itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would live or vanish. That was hers alone. A soft knock pulled her from the haze. The young lieutenant, the one who had dared speak up in the briefing, stood at the door. He held something small in his hands. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the mechanics found this wedged by the seat rail." He extended his palm, her grandfather's compass. She took it carefully, her thumb brushing the dented casing. The needle wobbled, then steadied north. "Thank you," she whispered. The lieutenant hesitated. "If you don't mind me saying, what you did out there, it gave us more than victory, it gave us belief." Her throat tightened. She forced a nod. "Belief is what keeps you alive when nothing else will." When he left, she turned the compass in her hands. North, always north. A truth that outlasted radars, missiles, even fortresses. She placed it on the desk, its needle quivering faintly, as if acknowledging the path she had drawn. Outside, the base buzzed with life. Journalists prepared their reports. Officers drafted commendations. Politicians sharpened speeches about resilience and inevitability. But inside her small room sat in silence. No medals, no applause, just the weight of having walked alone through fire. She understood now why her grandfather never spoke of his own missions with glory. Because the sky does not hand out triumph. It hands out survival, and survival is always heavier than it looks from the ground. She exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in pride, in acceptance. Because tomorrow, new fortresses would rise, new nets would tighten, and she would carry this silence with her again. Why was her name everywhere when her voice was nowhere? The morning after the strikes, the world awoke to headlines that did not ask questions, they declared answers. 9 fortresses fallen overnight, the Spirit in the sky. Kain's corridor, the flight that changed the war. Television anchors said her name as if it had always belonged in history. Politicians recited speeches that spoke of inevitability, of strategy, of strength, but not of the silence in the cockpit, the storm-ridden valleys, the seconds stretched thin as razor wire. Storm Kain sat alone in the mess hall, a mug of black coffee cooling between her hands, watching the reports flicker across the mounted screen. Her face, captured grainy by a long-lens camera as she stepped off, looped again and again. Each replay felt like theft. It wasn't the mission they were celebrating. It was a myth, and myths had no room for silence, no room for the trembling hands she had hidden when no one was looking. Mercer entered quietly, drawing salutes from soldiers who pretended not to glance at her. He sat across from her, setting his own coffee down. His expression was unreadable. "They're calling you the Falcon of," he said. She frowned. "I'm not a falcon." "No," he agreed. "You're the pilot who drew a line no one else dared, but they need symbols. Symbols don't hesitate. Symbols don't bleed." She sipped her coffee, bitter on her tongue. "And if I refuse to be their symbol?" His jaw tightened. "They'll turn you into one anyway. The only choice you have is whether you let them do it without your voice." Her voice, that was the part they never wanted. They wanted her image, her mission, her silence, not her truth. Later that day, she stood in the hangar beside, watching mechanics work. The bomber's black skin bore no scars, no proof of the firestorm she had flown it through. To anyone else, it looked untouched. Only she knew where the strain lines hid, buried in steel, waiting for time to reveal them. Colonel Cross approached, his hands behind his back. For a moment he said nothing, just studied the bomber as if seeing it new. "You flew her harder than anyone thought possible," he said finally. "I flew her the way the sky demanded." He nodded. "You're right, the manuals need rewriting." A pause, then softer. "So do the minds in those briefing rooms." She glanced at him, searching for sarcasm but found none, just honesty. Cross drew a slow breath. "I misjudged you, I won't again." That admission from him meant more than any headline. She inclined her head, not in triumph, in acknowledgement. But outside the base, the myth only grew. Camera crews gathered at the gates. Reporters called her a hero, a savior, a ghost in the sky. They repeated the story until the real one disappeared. And every night, she returned to her quarters, closed the door, and sat with the silence that none of them could imagine. The compass lay on her desk. Its needle quivered faintly. She traced it with her thumb, remembering her grandfather's lesson. Stars don't lie. But what about men? What about institutions that turned blood into speeches, silence into spectacle? The first commendation came a week later, a medal pinned to her chest in a ceremony that felt rehearsed. Applause washed over her, but her eyes drifted beyond the stage, toward the horizon. The medal was heavy, but not in the way weight should be. It was political, a token meant to shine under lights, not in truth. Mercer stood beside her on the platform, his face stone. When the ceremony ended, he leaned close. "Do not confuse recognition with respect. They overlap, but they are not the same." She nodded once. She understood. At night she dreamed of the Ninth Fortress, not of its destruction but of the silence just before, the air thick with waiting, the sky holding its breath. She woke with her palms sweating, her throat dry. The legend outside her walls grew louder. The silence inside her room grew heavier. One evening the young lieutenant visited again. He carried no medals, no speeches, just wide eyes and a voice that still cracked under weight. "Ma'am," he said, "the cadets are already studying your run. They trace your line on the maps like scripture." She shook her head gently. "Tell them not to worship the line. Tell them to question it, to redraw it if it doesn't fit the sky they face." His brow furrowed. "But you saved us." Her voice softened. "No, I survived. Saving is what they've decided to call it." When he left, she sat in the quiet again, staring at the compass. North, always north, yet somehow she felt further from it than ever. Because north was truth, and what surrounded her now was myth. The base adjusted around her presence. Soldiers who once doubted her now stood in her path. Mechanics polished with reverence. Officers measured their words carefully in her presence. Respect, yes, but also distance. She had become something untouchable, too large for normal conversation. And she hated it. Late one night, Mercer found her in the hangar, seated on the wing of staring into the dark. "You don't look like someone who just changed the war," he said. "Because I don't feel like it." He studied her for a long moment. "Then what do you feel like?" She considered the question. Her voice was quiet when it came. "Alone." The words settled heavy between them. Mercer nodded slowly. "That's the part they'll never write in the reports, the part they'll never tell the cadets, but it's the truth every soldier carries, whether they admit it or not." She looked at him, surprised at the honesty. The general who once dismissed her now spoke with something closer to kinship. "You'll learn," he added, "that sometimes silence is the only metal worth carrying. The rest are just noise." She turned her gaze back too, its black wings merging with the shadows. Maybe he was right. Maybe silence was the only way to keep dignity intact in a world eager to paint legends where human lives had stood. She placed her hand flat against the wing, feeling its cold surface. No scars, no applause, just steel. And in her quarters later, she turned the compass once more. The needle quivered, then settled. North, always north. But as the myth of the falcon of spread, she wondered if anyone would ever remember that the silence weighed more than the glory. How long does a legend last before the enemy tests it? The ruins of the 9 fortresses still smoked, yet intelligence reports whispered a new truth. The enemy was regrouping, not in confusion anymore, but in fury. Convoys moved at night, rebuilding defenses. New radars were trucked into valleys. A different kind of silence hung over the comms, not collapse but planning. They had refused to believe the strike was carried out by a single pilot. Their broadcasts called it propaganda, a fabrication meant to frighten. No one could have destroyed 9 fortresses alone, they said. No one could have threaded impossible valleys in a single night. And so, to prove the legend false, they prepared to strike back. At Fort, the mood shifted. Officers who once cheered now sat tense in briefings. The myth of the Falcon had been powerful, but myths alone didn't stop convoys or new missile batteries. General Mercer leaned over the operations table, his jaw tight. "They will come, they must. Their pride demands it, and when they do, it will be heavier than before." Colonel Cross studied the map. Red markers across valleys had once flown. "They've doubled radar coverage, tripled missile emplacements. It's no longer a corridor, it's a wall." The room fell silent. No one wanted to say what they all thought, not even can break through again. But said nothing. She sat at the edge of the room, arms folded, listening, watching. Mercer's gaze flicked toward her, then back to the map. "If we send her again and she falls, the legend collapses with her. If we hold her back, we may lose the only weapon they still fear." Cross's voice was low, deliberate. "She is not a weapon, she's a pilot. You risk turning her into something less or something more than human." The tension thickened. Officers shifted uncomfortably. Mercer finally exhaled. "Kain, what do you think?" All eyes turned, lifted her gaze from the map. Her voice was quiet, steady. "I think the question isn't whether they come, it's whether we wait for them on our terms or theirs." "Which means," Mercer pressed. Her eyes drifted to the glowing corridor she had drawn days ago. "Which means I go back up, not to prove a myth, to remind them myths don't matter, reality does." The room fractured into whispers, some horrified, some emboldened. Cross's jaw clenched. When the meeting ended, he found her in the hangar, sitting beneath wing. "You're too willing to carry this alone," he said, his tone rough. She looked up at him. "Isn't that what the cockpit is, alone?" He shook his head. "Not like this. You don't just carry missions anymore. You carry a symbol, and symbols break differently than people." Her voice softened. That's exactly why I can't let it stay only a symbol. Legends don't bleed, I do, and they need to know that. Cross stared at her, struggling between respect and fear. Finally, he sighed. Then at least let me fly your wing. She almost smiled. Doesn't take wingmen. Silence lingered, heavy, human. That night she lay awake in her quarters, the compass spinning faintly on her desk. The needle quivered, unsettled. She stared at it, wondering if North itself doubted the path she was about to take. Her grandfather's voice returned in memory. Sometimes the sky doesn't forgive. Sometimes it only asks if you'll fly anyway. At dawn, the decision was made. Mercer called her to his office, the blinds half closed against rising sun. His face looked older than she had ever seen. You know what this means if you fail, he said quietly. I know. You know what it means if you succeed. Her eyes didn't waver. I know that too. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Then take and remind them. The hangar roared alive once more. Mechanics fueled, armed, checked systems with hands that moved faster than their thoughts. Soldiers stood as she walked past, the air heavy with unspoken belief. At the ladder, Cross stopped her. His voice was rough, almost breaking. If you don't come back. She cut him off gently. Then make sure the line doesn't die with me. He held her gaze, then nodded, not as officer to subordinate, as one pilot to another. She climbed into his cockpit. The canopy sealed, screens glowed, engines stirred, deep and resonant like the heartbeat of something older than steel. She rested her hands on the yoke. For a moment, she let silence wash over her, the kind of silence that asked questions only she could answer. The radio crackled. Spirit 1 cleared for departure. She whispered to herself, softer than breath, Legends don't bleed, but I do. Throttle forward. The bomber rolled, lifted, severed Earth again. And as climbed into hostile sky, the world braced for a second reckoning. What happens when the enemy decides you cannot exist? The sky above their territory was thick with fire. Not scattered missiles, not frantic sweeps, but a wall of fury. Interceptors flew in coordinated packs. Radars overlapped like woven nets. Missiles launched in volleys, each one a message. If you are real, you will not survive this. The spirit of cut through clouds, black wings nearly invisible, but invisibility was no longer enough. They weren't hunting shadows anymore. They were hunting her. Alarms shrieked across her cockpit. Guidance systems scrambled, jammed until screens flickered with nonsense. Her instruments showed chaos, but chaos wasn't new. Her breath steadied. Her eyes closed for a fraction of a second. She remembered the desert, the compass in her grandfather's hands, his voice, stars don't lie. She looked beyond the screens, beyond the noise. She trusted the sky. The first missiles streaked past, detonating in blossoms of light that rattled her teeth. She banked into a canyon so narrow her wingtips brushed stone. The bomber groaned under strain, but it held. Always it held. Interceptors screamed overhead, blind to her path below. She released countermeasures, heat signatures scattering like sparks into night. The sky confused, cluttered, buying her seconds. Seconds were survival. She climbed again, pushing higher into thinner air. Her chest ached from the G-force, her breath sharp. Sweat blurred her vision, but her hands remained steady. She wasn't chasing perfection. She was chasing life. The enemy unleashed wave after wave, but something strange began to happen. The harder they pressed, the more their systems fractured. Their missiles collided mid-air, chasing false echoes. Their fighters crossed into each other's paths, confusion breaking cohesion. Her strikes came precise, patient. Not 9 fortresses this time, but mobile batteries, convoy hubs, radars on trucks that thought they were hidden. Each release was deliberate. Each impact frayed their fury further. Minutes felt like hours, hours like a lifetime. Inside the cockpit, she whispered once, I am not your myth. Because that was the truth. She wasn't invincible. She wasn't untouchable. She was flesh, blood, and will. And yet, that was enough to make her real in a way legends never could be. At last, the sky quieted. The final interceptor vanished on her scope, retreating. The radars flickered one by one into silence. The storm had burned itself out. She exhaled, long, heavy. Her body trembled with exhaustion, every muscle screaming, but her hands never faltered on the yoke. The radio crackled faintly through static. Mercer's voice, rough as gravel but softer than she had ever heard it. "Spirit One, do you copy?" Her throat tightened. "Copy, sir." "Are you alive?" She almost laughed, almost, but her reply was steady. "Alive and still northbound." The silence that followed was thick but not doubting. It was reverence. Hours later, touched down at Fort. The base erupted again, soldiers rushing to the runway, voices rising, hands clapping. But she didn't hear it as triumph. She heard it as distance, because no one cheering had been inside that cockpit. She climbed down, helmet tucked under her arm. Her steps were slower this time, heavier. She met Mercer's gaze, crosses, the lieutenants. None of them spoke at first. Finally, Mercer nodded once. No words, just acknowledgement. In her quarters that night, the compass sat on her desk again. The needle pointed steady. North, always north. She turned it slowly in her palm, thinking of her grandfather, of the desert, of stars that never lied. And she realized what victory really was. Not applause, not medals, not even survival. Victory was silence carried with dignity. Victory was action that spoke where words never could. The myth of the Falcon would live on. They would tell stories of a pilot who destroyed 9 fortresses alone, who returned to the sky when no one else dared. They would make her larger than life, untouchable. But the truth was simpler. She was touchable, breakable, human. And it was precisely that humanity, that willingness to bleed, to doubt, to still act, that had carried her farther than any myth ever could. She whispered into the stillness of her room, words no one else would ever hear. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." The compass quivered once, then steadied, north. She set it down, closed her eyes, and let the silence rest not as burden but as truth.